She caught her groom kissing her best friend inside the church closet, minutes before their wedding. And when she walked down that aisle anyway and told the truth in front of 200 people, a Korean mafia boss kicked open the cathedral doors and offered to marry her on the spot. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with everything, this story is for you. Drop a like, comment the city you're watching from, and follow along because I need to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it, and I promise you, you will not see what's coming next. The dress was ivory, not white. Zuri had been deliberate about that. White felt like a lie, and she had never been interested in lying about who she was. Ivory was honest. Ivory said, "I know what I'm walking into." She'd ordered it 8 months ago from a small atelier in Midtown, paid for it herself because Marcus had offered, and she'd said no without thinking, the refusal coming from somewhere instinctual, some quiet part of her that understood, even then, that a man who buys your wedding dress owns something he shouldn't. She was 29 years old. She had a master's degree in marketing communications, a corner office at a brand strategy firm that had taken her 6 years to earn, and an apartment in Crown Heights that she'd furnished slowly and deliberately with things she actually loved rather than things that looked good on someone else's Instagram. She had worked for every single thing she possessed. She had asked for very little and expected less. She should have expected this. The prep room was tucked behind the sacristy, a long narrow space with cream-colored walls and a mirror that ran the full length of one side. The church was St. Augustine's, a massive Gothic structure on the Upper West Side that Marcus had selected because his mother wanted it, and Marcus, for all his talk about being his own man, had never once successfully told his mother no about anything. Zuri had agreed to the venue because she'd been tired of negotiating. That was her first mistake. Not the last. Her maid of honor, Danielle, had left the room 20 minutes ago to check on the floral arrangements. That's what she'd said. "I'll just run and check on the flowers, Zoo. Be right back." She'd squeezed Zuri's hand and smiled that wide, warm smile that Zuri had been trusting since they were 19 years old, sharing a dorm room at Howard, and then she'd walked out the door in her pale gold bridesmaid dress, and Zuri had gone back to staring at herself in the mirror, practicing the particular expression she wanted to wear when she walked down the aisle. Not nervous, not trembling, but present. Steady. Herself. The earrings Marcus had given her as a wedding morning gift sat in a velvet box on the vanity. Diamond drops. Elegant. Expensive. She hadn't put them on yet. She kept looking at them and then looking away. She needed water. The caterers had a station set up just past the sacristy, near the supply corridor that ran alongside the back of the main hall. Zuri gathered the front of her dress. The train was cathedral length, another concession to Marcus's mother, and moved carefully through the door, heels clicking on the stone floor. The distant sound of the string quartet warming up, bleeding through the walls like something beautiful happening in another life. She heard it before she understood it. A sound from the supply closet at the end of the corridor. The door wasn't fully closed, just slightly ajar, the old wood swollen from last night's rain and not catching properly in the frame. Zuri stopped moving. Her brain processed the sound in fragments. A low voice, words she couldn't make out, then a breath, then silence, then the specific soft collision of two bodies that need no words at all. She stood in the corridor for 4 full seconds. Then she pushed the door open. Marcus had Danielle pressed against the metal shelving unit that held extra candles and folded linens, his hands in her hair, her hands at his waist, their faces so close together that it took a half second for either of them to register the light flooding in. When they did, they separated like something had exploded between them. Marcus stumbled backward. His boutonniere, white rose, Zuri's choice, caught on the shelf and tore loose and fell to the floor. Danielle made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Her lipstick was smeared. The pale gold dress was wrinkled at the hip. "Zuri," Marcus said. She looked at him. She looked at Danielle. She looked at the boutonniere on the floor. She turned around and walked back down the corridor. "Zuri, wait. Zuri, please, just wait." She didn't wait. She walked through the sacristy and into the prep room and stood in front of the long mirror and looked at herself for a very long time. Her hands were perfectly still. That surprised her. She'd expected them to shake. She'd always imagined in the abstract, terrible way that people sometimes imagined betrayal before they'd actually experienced it, that her hands would shake. Instead, her hands were still, and her face was composed, and the only evidence that anything had changed was the way she was breathing, slow and too deliberate. The way you breathe when you are rationing air because you are not sure how much you have left. 3 years. She had given Marcus Holt 3 years of her life. She'd taken him home to her parents in Baltimore. She'd rearranged her schedule around his work travel, around his moods, around the particular architecture of his needs. She had defended him to her mother, who had always been politely cool toward him in a way Zuri had attributed to her mother's general difficulty with change rather than any actual insight into Marcus's character. She had told Danielle things about her relationship that she had never told anyone. Doubts, frustrations, the small private disappointments that accumulate over years with a person who is fundamentally more interested in being loved than in loving. Danielle had listened to all of it. Danielle had held her hand through all of it. The string quartet had moved from warm-up to an actual piece now, something elegant and measured drifting through the stone walls. 200 guests were sitting in the pews. Marcus's mother was in the front row. Zuri's parents had flown in from Baltimore and were somewhere in the crowd, her father in the suit he'd bought specifically for this occasion, her mother wearing the green dress they'd picked out together on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks ago at a department store in Towson. The two of them standing in the fitting room laughing about nothing in particular, happy. Zuri picked up the diamond earrings from the velvet box. She put them on. Then she picked up her bouquet, white peonies, her actual choice, one of the few things she'd gotten exactly as she wanted. And she walked to the door and she opened it and she went to get married. The walk down the aisle was the longest she'd ever taken. The church was full of candlelight and late morning sun cutting through the stained glass, throwing fractured color across the stone floor and the white-covered pews and the 200 faces turning toward her as the music swelled. She saw her mother's face light up and then shift, almost imperceptibly, as she registered something in Zuri's expression that didn't match the moment. Her father beamed. He didn't notice. Fathers were often the last to know. Marcus was standing at the altar. He'd fixed the boutonniere. Someone must have had a spare or he'd managed to reattach it because it was back on his lapel, slightly crooked but present. He was smiling. That was the thing that sealed something cold and final inside her chest. He was smiling as she walked toward him, the broad, practiced smile of a man who had calculated his odds and decided they were acceptable, who had looked at the situation and concluded that she would swallow it, that she would say nothing because the alternative was too humiliating, that she knew him well enough to know that women like her, careful women, controlled women, women who hated scenes, would choose silence over spectacle every single time. He didn't know her at all. The ceremony began. The officiant spoke. The guests settled. Zuri stood across from Marcus and held her bouquet and kept her breathing steady and waited. If anyone present knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, the officiant said, settling into the familiar cadence of the words, speak now, or forever hold your peace. The room went quiet in that particular expectant way that it always did at this moment. A held breath, a collective courtesy pause before the ritual continued. Zuri turned and faced the congregation. Actually, she said. Her voice was clear. Not loud, not theatrical, just clear, carrying in the stone acoustics without effort, the way a voice does when it has something real to say. 200 people stiffened in their seats. The officiant stopped. Marcus's smile flickered. I do, she said. She turned back toward Marcus, and she looked at him directly, and she did not look away while she spoke. She told them what she had found in the supply corridor. She was specific. She was not cruel, but she was specific, because vagueness would have allowed him to deny it, and she was done allowing him anything. She said Danielle's name. She described the pale gold dress and the smeared lipstick and the boutonniere on the floor. She said it all in the same clear, steady voice. And when she was done, the silence in the church was total and absolute, every person in the room frozen in the particular horror of witnessing something that cannot be unseen. Then it broke. Marcus's mother stood up and said something sharp and cutting in Marcus's direction that Zuri couldn't fully hear. Someone gasped. A child in the back row started to cry, confused by the adult electricity in the room. Danielle, who had apparently slipped into the church somewhere during the procession, was suddenly visible near the side aisle, and a ripple of recognition moved through the crowd as heads turned. Marcus said Zuri's name once, twice, reaching for her arm, and she stepped back from his hand with the particular precision of someone who has already decided. The chaos was building, voices, movement, the scrape of pew benches. When the cathedral doors at the far end of the nave burst open, not opened, burst, both of them, simultaneously, with the kind of force that implied they'd been pulled rather than pushed, or that the person entering had simply decided that doors were a formality that didn't apply to them. The noise in the church contracted into a new silence. 4 men entered first, large, dark-suited, moving with the synchronized calm of people who had rehearsed violence until it became posture. They spread to either side of the entrance without being directed, which meant they didn't need direction, which meant whoever was behind them was the kind of person whose security team operated on anticipation rather than instruction. Then he walked in. Kong Min-jae was not what Zuri expected, though she could not have said in that moment what she'd expected. He was tall, taller than she'd registered possible from the doorway, with a leanness that read less like fitness and more like the natural result of a body that operated at a sustained intensity. He was dressed in a charcoal suit with no tie, the collar of his white shirt open 2 buttons, which should have read as casual but instead registered as controlled. A man who had made a deliberate decision about every single thing he was wearing and had decided that the tie was not necessary for what he'd come to do. His face was sharp, the jaw set, his eyes moving through the room with a slow, systematic efficiency that took in everything and lingered on nothing except, at last, Marcus. He walked up the center aisle. 200 people did not move. He stopped 6 feet from the altar and looked at Marcus Holt with an expression that contained no anger, which was somehow more frightening than if it had. "Mr. Holt," he said. His English was precise and unaccented, or rather, accented in the way of someone who had learned the language from multiple sources and kept the best parts of each. "I've been looking for you." Marcus had gone gray, genuinely gray, the blood dropping from his face with a visible speed that told Zuri everything she needed to know about what this man represented. I don't... There's been a mistake." "There hasn't." Min-jae did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The acoustics of the church and the total silence of the congregation did the work. $4.3 million, moved through 3 shell accounts and a real estate holding company registered in Delaware. He paused. "My money, Mr. Holt, from my organization. You've been stealing from me for 14 months. The room processed this information in real time, and Zuri watched it happen. The recalibration of everything everyone thought they knew about the man standing at the altar, the recontextualization of the expensive wedding and the Upper West Side venue, and the honeymoon in the Maldives that Marcus had planned with such specific enthusiasm. She thought about how he'd managed the wedding finances, how he'd insisted on handling certain vendors directly, how there had been accounts she'd asked about once, and he'd explained away with a fluency that she'd attributed to competence rather than practice. She thought, of course. Marcus was talking fast now, the words coming out in a particular pattern she recognized. Justification layered over justification, each one slightly different from the last, which meant none of them were true. The bodyguards near the entrance had closed the doors, not aggressively but firmly, and several of the wedding guests nearest them had gone very still in the particular way of people calculating whether this was the moment to move. Min-jae let Marcus talk for approximately 15 seconds. Then he held up one hand, and Marcus stopped. Min-jae turned and looked at Zuri. It was the first time he'd looked at her directly, and the experience was disorienting in a way she couldn't immediately explain, not because the look was threatening, but because it was assessing, genuinely assessing, the way a person looks at you when they are trying to determine something specific and haven't decided yet. "You're the bride," he said. "Was," Zuri said. Past tense. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but a fractional adjustment around the eyes that acknowledged she had said something he hadn't anticipated. "You know what he did?" he asked. "I know what he did to me," Zuri said. "I'm now understanding the scope was broader." Min-jae studied her for a moment. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document which he held out toward her. She didn't take it immediately. He waited. She took it. It was a contract. Dense, single-spaced, multiple pages folded together. She couldn't read it in full standing in the middle of a church with 200 people watching, but the language at the top was clear enough. A legal agreement, formal, detailed, the kind of document that had been prepared by someone with very good lawyers and very specific intentions. My grandfather is 79 years old, Min-jae said. He has certain requirements for the transfer of his company's leadership. Specifically, he requires that the successor be married. He paused. I'm not. Zuri looked up from the document. I need a wife, Min-jae said. Not a real one. A contractual arrangement. 1 year, full legal validity, all terms specified. You would be compensated, protected. At the end of 12 months, you would be free to leave with enough resources to go wherever you want and do whatever you choose. Zuri became aware distantly of the sounds of the congregation, the whispers, the shuffling, someone crying softly, somewhere behind her. She became aware of Marcus to her left, very still now, watching this exchange with the particular expression of a man who has lost control of a situation and knows it. She became aware of her bouquet in her hands, the white peonies already starting to feel heavy. Why me? She said. Because you're standing in a church in a wedding dress with nothing left to protect in this room, Min-jae said. Because you didn't flinch. And because I have a limited window to resolve this, and you're available. It was the least romantic proposal in recorded human history. It was also honest in a way that Marcus's 3 years of careful romantic architecture had never once been. Zuri looked at the contract. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Danielle, who had moved to the edge of the aisle and was watching with an expression that combined guilt with a particular species of waiting to see what Zuri would do, ready to step into whatever space her absence created. She looked at Min-jae. Do you have a pen? She said. The silence in the cathedral cracked open. Min-jae reached into his jacket and produced a pen. Matte black, expensive, the kind of object that suggested a man who signed documents frequently and had decided to invest in the instrument. He held it out. Zuri took it. You should read it first, he said. I'll read it in the car, she said. Do you have a car? Several. Then let's go. She turned and handed her bouquet to the nearest stunned bridesmaid. Not Danielle, the other one, a woman named Priya, who had stood through the entire morning with the specific shell-shocked expression of someone watching a film that kept changing genres. And she walked down the center aisle of St. Augustine's Cathedral beside Kang Min-jae while 200 people watched in absolute silence. At the doors, she stopped. She turned back. She found her mother's face in the crowd. Her mother, who was gripping her father's arm with both hands, whose expression was a complicated mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, like she had always known that her daughter was too much for the life she'd been trying to fit into. I'm okay, Zuri said, loud enough to carry. I'll call you. Then the doors opened and the October air hit her like something physical, cold and sharp and real, and she walked out of the church in her ivory dress and her diamond earrings and a ruined wedding and into the black SUV that was idling at the curb. The city continued around her, yellow cabs, a food cart. 2 tourists stopped on the sidewalk photographing the church facade. An ordinary Tuesday in New York, indifferent to catastrophe. Inside the car, she unfolded the contract and started reading. Min-jae got in on the other side. The doors closed. The vehicle moved. He said nothing. His security team occupied a second vehicle behind them, another in front. She read. The terms were specific and in their specificity almost reassuring. The kind of document that had been drafted by someone who understood that clarity is a form of respect. She would occupy a private suite within his primary residence. She would have an allowance, substantial enough that the number made her blink. She would be required to attend certain family events and present as his wife to a defined list of people, primarily his grandfather and those closest to him. She would have access to a personal security detail. She would have freedom of movement within reasonable security parameters. At the end of 12 months, the marriage would be dissolved through a prearranged legal process, and she would leave with a settlement amount that was, conservatively, more money than she'd expected to earn in the next 15 years combined. She turned to the last page. There was a signature line for her, already dated. Below Min-jae's printed name, he had already signed. She looked up from the document. The city was moving past the tinted windows. Fifth Avenue, the park. Heading north or downtown, she couldn't tell yet. There's a clause on page 7, she said. Section 4, subsection C. Parties agree that the arrangement remains confidential and that neither party will disclose its contractual nature to third parties without mutual consent. That includes my family? Min-jae looked at her from the other side of the car. Yes. I need to be able to tell my mother. He was quiet for a moment. That's a liability. She's 71 years old and she just watched her daughter leave a church with a stranger. If I can't tell her the truth, she'll spend the next 12 months believing I've lost my mind or joined something. Another pause, then, amend it, write it in. I don't have... He reached forward to the center console and produced another pen, same model, matte black. She took it. She found section 4, subsection C, and she wrote in the margin in small, precise letters. Exception. Disclosure permitted to immediate family member, singular, subject to equivalent confidentiality expectation. She initialed it. She slid the document across the leather seat to him. He read the amendment, picked up the pen, and initialed beside hers without comment. Okay, Zuri said. Okay, he said. The car moved through the city. The contract sat on the seat between them. Outside, New York went about its business, enormous and uncaring, making no accommodations for whatever had just happened inside that church. Zuri pressed the back of her head against the seat and looked at the ceiling of the vehicle and thought, I have $600 in my checking account, a dress that cost $4,000, and a job I'll probably have to take leave from. I have a mother who is going to call me approximately every 40 minutes for the next week. I have an ex-fiancé who has been stealing from a criminal organization and a former best friend who has been stealing from me in a different way. And I am currently in a moving vehicle with a man I do not know, heading to a location I have not yet been told. She thought, I've made worse decisions? She hadn't, but it helped to think so. Where are we going? She asked. My residence, Min-jae said. On the Hudson. We'll get you settled, and then there are some things I need to explain about the current situation. The current situation meaning your uncle. He looked at her sharply. You read fast. Section 9, she said. Potential threats to the contractual arrangement, subsection 1. You've listed a family member as the primary threat vector. I filled in the context. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was different from the assessment in the church. This was something closer to recalibration, the adjustment that happens when someone reveals that they are not quite what you initially categorized them as. My uncle Dae-sung, Min-jae said. He has been positioning for control of the organization for 11 years. My grandfather's announcement of my succession will not be received well. And a married successor is harder to challenge than an unmarried one. Significantly. What does significantly mean in practical terms? It means my grandfather's generation still holds to certain values around family structure and stability. A successor with a wife signals roots, permanence, someone who has something to lose beyond themselves. He paused. Dae-sung is unmarried. Has been for years. It's a perception problem he hasn't managed to solve. And you think marrying a black woman he's never met, 3 hours after she walked out of her own wedding, signals stability. I think my grandfather will respond to the directness of it, Min-jae said. He values people who act rather than deliberate. And if he hates me, he won't. You seem very confident about that. I am. Why? Min-jae looked out the window at the river, now visible as they moved along the west side. Because you stood up in a church in front of 200 people and told the truth when the easier thing, the much easier thing, was to say nothing. My grandfather spent 40 years in a business where people say nothing. He recognizes someone who doesn't when he sees one. Zuri was quiet. Also, Min-jae added, almost as an afterthought, you negotiated an amendment to a contract in the back of a moving car while still wearing your wedding dress. He'll respect that too. She looked down at herself. She'd forgotten, momentarily, what she was wearing. The ivory silk. The cathedral train bunched at her feet because there wasn't enough room to fully extend it. I need clothes, she said. There will be arrangements made. And I need to call my mother before she has a full cardiac event. You can use my phone. He held it out to her. She took it. She dialed from memory. She'd made a practice of memorizing her mother's number, a refusal to be entirely dependent on technology for the things that mattered, and listened to it ring twice before her mother picked up. Baby. Her mother's voice was thick, not with tears but with the controlled compression of someone who had been storing them. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm safe," Zuri said. "I need you to listen to me and not ask questions yet. I'm safe. I'm going somewhere and I'll explain as soon as I can explain it properly. I need you to tell Daddy not to call Marcus." Zuri, "Mom, do you trust me?" A silence, long enough to hurt. Then, "Yes, okay. I'll call you tonight. Don't call Marcus. Don't let Daddy call Marcus. And Mom," she paused. "What I did today, was it the worst thing you've ever seen me do or not the worst?" Her mother was quiet for a moment, then, softly, "Not even close to the worst, baby." Something in Zuri's chest that had been locked hard since the supply closet released just slightly. "Okay," she said. "I'll call you tonight." She ended the call. She held the phone for a moment, then held it out to return it to Min-jae. He took it. The vehicle was turning now, leaving the main road for a private drive that wound down toward the water. Through the windshield she could see a gate, iron, substantial, with security infrastructure visible at the posts. And beyond it, set back from the river, a structure that was large enough that calling it a house felt technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. "One question," Zuri said. "Yes. Marcus. What happens to him?" Min-jae was quiet for a beat. "That's being handled." "By who?" "By me. I'd like to know the parameters of handled." Another pause. He turned to look at her with an expression that was opaque but not unkind, the face of someone deciding how much to say to someone they haven't fully categorized yet. "He won't be physically harmed," Min-jae said. "That's not how I operate with civilians. But the money will be recovered. Everything built with it will be unwound. Every professional relationship he has will become aware of what he is. Every financial door he's currently standing in front of will close." He paused. "He will lose everything that mattered to him, in the order that it matters most to him." Zuri thought about Marcus's face in the church when he'd seen Min-jae walk through the doors. She thought about the gray that had dropped over his features. She thought about 3 years of carefully constructed lies, the specific, practiced effort required to maintain them, all of it serving a man who would eventually turn it against her without a moment's genuine regret. "Okay," she said. The gate opened. The car moved through. The estate spread before her in the October light, enormous and severe and strangely beautiful, a world she had no framework for, and she was walking into it in an ivory wedding dress with a signed contract and a borrowed pen and approximately nothing left to lose. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known in that moment, was that Min-jae's uncle Dae-sung had already been informed of the day's events, that a man who had spent 11 years accumulating power did not receive news of a rival's sudden marriage without responding, that the contract on the seat beside her, the one that was supposed to simplify everything, had instead just placed her name on a list she didn't know existed, and that in 3 days, someone was going to try to access Min-jae's private files, not from outside the organization, but from within it. Someone who had been inside for years. Someone Zuri, impossibly, had already met. The estate was called Seohan House, though no one had referred to it by that name in Zuri's presence yet. She learned it by reading the small brass plate mounted beside the secondary entrance they used when the main gate was under security review, which it was. Min-jae's head of security informed him in clipped Korean as they walked through the side corridor, switching to English only when Min-jae's expression indicated the shift was necessary. His name was Park Sung-il, late 40s, broad through the shoulders, a scar along his left jawline that had healed cleanly enough to suggest good medical care rather than neglect. He walked 2 steps behind Min-jae and 1 step to the left, which told Zuri something about the choreography of this household. Everything had a position, and those positions had been established over time through a logic she didn't yet understand. She followed them through a corridor that opened into a main hall, with ceilings high enough to make her feel briefly architectural, the kind of space designed less for comfort than for the communication of scale. Stone floors, dark wood panels, the particular restrained opulence of someone who had enough money to buy anything and had decided that what they wanted was quality rather than volume. There were no family photographs on the walls. There were no family photographs anywhere she could see, which she noted because it was an absence that told you something about what the family thought of itself. A woman appeared at the far end of the hall. 50s, precise posture, her dark hair pulled back with the severity of someone who had decided long ago that softness was a resource not to be wasted on appearance. She looked at Zuri with the measured expression of someone processing new information and already deciding how to categorize it.
Mrs. Oh, Min-jae said. This is Zuri. She'll need the East Suite prepared and something to change into. She's close to... He glanced at Zuri with the brief clinical look of someone estimating dimensions. 5'7", approximately. 5'8", Zuri said. 5'8", he repeated to Mrs. O without inflection. Mrs. O nodded once and disappeared.
Min-jae turned to Zuri. The East Suite is the largest guest accommodation. Private bathroom, sitting room, exterior view. Mrs. O manages the household. If you need anything and I'm unavailable, she's your first contact. Not Park, Zuri said, glancing at the security chief. Park is for security concerns. Mrs. O is for everything else. What's the line between those two categories in this house? Min-jae looked at her. That's a good question. It moves. He turned and walked toward the staircase, and she followed because there was nothing else to do. The train of her dress gathered in both hands, her heels clicking against the stone in a rhythm that felt absurdly ceremonial given the context. The East Suite was at the end of a long corridor on the second floor, and it was, as advertised, large. Large in the way that felt less like luxury and more like privacy. A sitting room with tall windows overlooking the Hudson, a bedroom beyond an open door, a bathroom that she clocked quickly and then looked away from because acknowledging how good it was felt like it would cost her something. Min-jae stopped at the threshold. He didn't come in. There's a briefing at 6, he said. My office, ground floor, east wing. I'll have someone come for you at 5:50. A briefing about what? The situation with Dae-sung has developed since this morning. Developed how? His jaw moved. Not much, just the slight tightening of someone editing themselves in real time. At 6, he said. Get changed. Eat something. Mrs. O will bring food. He left. She stood in the sitting room in her wedding dress and watched the Hudson through the tall windows, the water moving gray and impersonal under the October sky. And she thought about the word developed in the specific way he'd said it, controlled, but with something compressed underneath, the way a word sounds when it's doing more work than it appears to be. She unzipped the dress herself. It took a while. The zipper ran the length of her spine and she had to dislocate her shoulder somewhat to reach the pull. But she managed, and the dress came off, and she laid it across the back of the sofa with a care she recognized as automatic rather than sentimental. It was an expensive dress, and she'd been raised not to mistreat expensive things, even expensive things that had become evidence of a mistake. She stood in the sitting room in her slip and her diamond earrings and her heels. Then she took off the earrings and set them on the windowsill. She looked at them for a moment, then she put them in the small interior pocket of her wedding clutch, which she'd carried through the entire day by reflex, not because she'd needed it, but because she was a person who kept her hands occupied when she was managing herself. Mrs. O arrived 20 minutes later with a clothes selection that was more thoughtful than Zuri had expected. Dark trousers, a cream blouse, a charcoal blazer that was slightly large in the shoulders, but well cut enough that it worked, and flat shoes, which Zuri put on with a relief she didn't try to conceal. Thank you, she said. Mrs. O looked at her with that same measured expression. The dress, she said, nodding toward the ivory silk on the sofa. Store it somewhere, Zuri said. I don't want to look at it right now. Something shifted in Mrs. O's expression. Not warmth exactly, but an adjacent quality. The micro-expression of someone who has revised an initial assessment upward by a small but meaningful margin. She picked up the dress with practiced hands and carried it out. Zuri ate cold rice, grilled fish, pickled vegetables that Mrs. O had brought on a tray without being asked for a preference, which was either presumptuous or perceptive depending on how you chose to read it. The food was good. She was hungrier than she'd realized, which told her something about how much energy the morning had burned. At 5:50, a young man she hadn't seen before knocked on the sitting room door, gave her his name to June, and led her downstairs. Min-jae's office was not what she'd expected, which she recognized was becoming a pattern with him. She'd expected the aesthetic of power, dark wood, leather, the performative heaviness of a man who needed his environment to do work on his behalf. Instead, it was spare. A desk, a conference table that seated 8, several monitors on a side credenza, and on the wall behind the desk, a large topographic map of the eastern seaboard with several points marked in dry erase ink. The marks were recent. Some of them were still slightly damp. Min-jae was at the conference table. Park Sung-il was there. 2 other men she didn't know, both in their 30s, both with the specific attentiveness of people in the habit of not missing things. And 1 woman. She was seated at the far end of the table with a laptop open in front of her, and she looked up when Zuri entered with an expression that managed to be professionally neutral and personally calculating at the same time. The look of someone doing 2 things at once and not bothering to hide it. She was Korean, mid-30s, with dark hair cut in a way that was clearly deliberate and not inexpensive. The kind of woman who was effortlessly competent in a way that made you immediately want to know if she liked you. "Zuri," Min-jae said, standing, which she noted because it was the first time he'd made that particular gesture. "This is Lee Chaeyeon. She manages our financial intelligence and legal structure." "Chaeyeon," Zuri said. "Welcome," Chaeyeon said in English that was accented and precise. Her eyes did a quick survey and returned to neutral. "Sit wherever you're comfortable." Zuri sat across from Min-jae. Park Sung-il moved to the door and posted there. "This morning," Min-jae began, "while the ceremony was occurring, someone accessed the secondary server that holds our financial routing documentation. It was a read-only access. They didn't extract anything, but they were there and they knew exactly which partitions to navigate to." "Someone with inside knowledge," Zuri said. "Yes. The access originated from within the building," Chaeyeon said, turning her laptop to show a log screen. "This building. 12:53 p.m. The ceremony was at noon, so while I was walking down the aisle, someone in this house was reading your financial records," Zuri said. "Someone who knew we would be occupied," Min-jae said. "And who knew the access window?" The room was quiet. "You think it's Dae-sung's person," Zuri said. "I know it is," Min-jae said. "What I don't know is who." She looked around the table. The 2 men she didn't know. Chaeyeon, Park Sung-il at the door. Somewhere beyond this room, Mrs. O, and the young man named June, and how many other people occupying a house this size in rotation she couldn't yet guess. "You're telling me this?" she said. "Why?" "Because you live here now," Min-jae said. "For the next 12 months, this is your house. You need to understand what that means. It means someone in your organization might already know the marriage is a contract. It means someone in my organization is reporting to my uncle, and I don't yet know which layer of trust they've compromised." Zuri sat with that. "Walk me through Dae-sung," she said. "Not the summary version, the real version." Min-jae's jaw set slightly. It was the expression she was beginning to understand that appeared when he was deciding how much of a thing to give rather than whether to give it at all. "He's my father's younger brother," he said. "When my father died, I was 22. I had been working within the organization for 2 years, but I hadn't been positioned as heir. My father was still in good health. The question wasn't urgent. When he was gone, suddenly it was." He paused. Dae-sung moved fast. He had allies in the financial side, in 2 of the 3 primary operating divisions, and in my grandfather's immediate circle. He came very close. What stopped him? My grandfather. He looked at Dae-sung's balance sheets and found 4 years of discrepancies he hadn't been meant to find. He didn't confront them directly. He never does. But he recalibrated. He began positioning me instead. And Dae-sung knows that. Dae-sung has known that for 7 years. He spent those 7 years making himself indispensable in ways that are difficult to document and harder to remove. "And the marriage requirement," Zuri said. "That's real? That's your grandfather's actual condition." "It is. And Dae-sung can't meet it. He was married once. It ended badly. He cannot rebuild that particular optic in time." Zuri looked at the topographic map on the wall behind him, the dry erase marks. "How much time do we have before your grandfather expects a formal introduction?" Chaeyeon answered. "The quarterly family gathering is in 3 weeks. The Kong family convenes 4 times a year. The Q4 gathering is the largest. It's when the chairman typically makes succession-related announcements." 3 weeks, Zuri said. "To prepare you," Min-jae said, "for what you'll face, that the family is not... They will not be uncritical."
Because I'm black. He didn't blink. That is part of it, yes.
She appreciated the directness. It was the kind of directness that could have been delivered badly, but wasn't. It was just information, stated without apology or performance. What else, she said. Because you're American. Because you came from nowhere, in their understanding. Because Daesung will work to frame the marriage as impulsive at best and strategic fabrication at worst. He paused. He will try to find every weakness in you that he can locate and use it in that room. Then we'd better make sure he can't find any, Zuri said. A pause around the table. Not long, a beat, maybe two, but waited. That's the correct posture, Cheon said, with a slight precision that suggested she had not expected it. The meeting went another 90 minutes. Zuri learned the structure of the family business. Legitimate holdings across shipping, real estate, and technology infrastructure, overlaid with the other operations that the contract documents had described only obliquely. She learned the names of Min Jae's key allies within the organization and the 3 people who occupied ambiguous positions, present enough to be valuable, compromised enough to be watched. She learned the social structure of the family gathering. Who would be friendly? Who would be testing? Who would be directly hostile? She asked questions the whole time, specific ones. When she didn't understand something, she said so rather than covering it, which seemed to recalibrate the room incrementally. Not dramatically, but in the small, sustained way of people revising a category they'd placed you in without fully realizing they were doing it. Park Sung-il left the room once, early in the meeting, and returned 3 minutes later and placed a folded note on the table in front of Min Jae without speaking. Min Jae read it and folded it again and put it in his jacket pocket and continued the meeting as though nothing had occurred. But the muscle along his jaw had moved, she noticed. After the meeting, the others filed out. Chaeyeon was last, and at the door she paused and looked at Zuri with the same calculating quality she'd had throughout, but slightly reconfigured. Your background, she said. Marketing and brand strategy. Yes. Financial analysis component? Not formally, but I've done significant budget-level work. Media investment, campaign ROI, market positioning. Cheon nodded once, then she left. Zuri looked at Min Jae across the now empty table. The note Park brought you, she said. He looked at her. You put it in your pocket without reacting, she said, and then your jaw moved. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Daesung called my grandfather this afternoon. He told him the marriage was manufactured, that I had found a woman in crisis and exploited the situation to manufacture a legal arrangement. Zuri kept her face still. What did your grandfather say? He told Daesung that he would form his own opinion when he met my wife in 3 weeks. He paused. But the call was logged, which means Daesung wanted us to know he'd made it. He's not trying to be subtle anymore. He's escalating. Yes. Which means 3 weeks might not be how much time we have. Min Jae looked at her. Something in his expression was different from every version she'd seen today. Not harder, not softer, just more direct. The particular quality of a face dropping its secondary layer. No, he said. It might not be. She stood up. The charcoal blazer shifted on her shoulders. Then we need to be ready sooner than 3 weeks. Yes, starting tomorrow. I need to understand the family completely, not the briefing version, the true version. Whoever Daesung is likely to use against us, whatever history he can weaponize, whatever about this family your grandfather loves, and whatever makes him doubt. All of it. That's a significant amount of information. Then we should start early. Min Jae studied her for a moment. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the river through the window behind his desk, the low, constant movement of water. You're not afraid, he said. I'm absolutely afraid, she said. I'm just not going to let it make decisions for me. He held her gaze for a long second. Then he nodded, once. She walked to the door. At the threshold, she stopped. One more thing, she said. The server access this morning. The person in this building who read your financial records. Yes. They know I'm here now. They'll have told Daesung. Yes. Which means Daesung already knows exactly what your grandfather's response was to his call, because someone in this house probably listened to it. The silence that followed was the kind that confirmed rather than denied. Then we have a leak, she said. We have a leak, he agreed. And until we find it, every conversation we have in this building is potentially compromised.
Yes. She looked at him. He looked back. The weight of it sat between them in the doorway. Not manageable, not small, not the kind of thing that a contract and a compensation package could fully account for. Someone inside this house was feeding information to a man who had just told Min Jae's grandfather that the marriage was fake, and that man was going to keep escalating, and the 3 weeks they had been counting on had just become an unknown quantity. Okay, Zuri said. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the East Suite, and she allowed herself, for the first time since the supply closet, to feel the full weight of the day. Not to process it. There wasn't space for that yet. Just to feel it. The specific exhaustion that lives not in muscles, but in the part of you that has been running a calculation for hours without stopping. She had made a decision this morning that had seemed, in the moment, like an exit. A way out of one thing and into something temporary and financially rational. She had signed a contract and gotten in a car, and she had told herself it was clean, defined, 12 months, specific terms, then freedom. What it actually was, she understood now, was an entrance. She had walked out of one war and directly into another, except this one had guns she hadn't yet seen and enemies she couldn't yet name, and a mole somewhere in these walls who was going to report back to a man who had spent 11 years sharpening himself against exactly this moment. Her phone, returned to her by Min Jae in the car, and now the only object on the nightstand that connected her to anything she'd known before today, lit up with a text from her mother. I spoke with your father. He did not call Marcus. But Zuri, please, call me tonight. She picked up the phone. She started to dial. Then she stopped. There was a sound in the corridor outside her room. Not a knock. Just a presence. The particular quality of air near a door when someone is standing on the other side of it and hasn't moved for long enough to become a weight. She put the phone down. She crossed the room in her flat shoes silently, and she stood 3 inches from the door and she listened. Breathing. One person. Not aggressive. Controlled. The breathing of someone who was waiting, not threatening, but waiting for what? And since when, she couldn't say. She put her hand on the door handle, counted to 3, opened it. The corridor was empty. But the door to the linen closet 6 feet down the hallway, the one that had been closed when she'd walked past it an hour ago, was now open by 2 inches, and from somewhere on the floor below came the sound of footsteps moving quickly, then a door, then nothing. Someone had been outside her room, someone who knew this house well enough to disappear into it without a sound, who had been standing in the corridor of the private residential floor that was, according to Min Jae's briefing, restricted to a list of 12 people. Someone on that list. Someone who had either been sent to observe or had come of their own volition, which was, in some ways, worse. She stood in the doorway and looked at the open linen closet and understood, with a cold and clarifying certainty, that the leak in Min Jae's organization wasn't a distant abstraction. It was 12 months of waking up in this house, and someone in it had already decided to make that dangerous. Her phone lit up again on the nightstand. Another message. Not her mother this time. An unknown number, the text a single line. You should have stayed in the church. She stood in the doorway for 4 seconds with the phone in her hand, and the message on the screen and the empty corridor in front of her, and then she did something that surprised even herself. She took a screenshot of the message, forwarded it to Min Jae's number, and typed, Your corridor, your linen closet, 5 minutes ago. Someone was outside my room. Then she went back inside, closed the door, and locked it. Not because a lock would stop anyone in this house who genuinely wanted in. She understood that. The lock was for herself, a physical action in place of the panic she was refusing to have, something to do with her hands while her brain caught up to the situation. The message was a warning. The phrasing, you should have stayed in the church, was designed to land a specific way, not as a threat of immediate violence, but as a suggestion that she had made a mistake whose consequences were still arriving. Someone who wanted her dead would not text her first. Someone who wanted her afraid, though. Someone who wanted her to make a bad decision from a destabilized position. That was different. She put the phone face down on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed. 3 minutes later, a knock. It's me, Min Jae said through the door. She unlocked it. He came in alone, which was the first thing she registered. No park, no security, just him.
He was still in the charcoal suit, but he'd lost the jacket, and in the white shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, he looked less constructed than he had in the church, more like a person and less like a position. He looked at the phone on the nightstand, then at her. "The closet was empty when Park checked it," he said. "I know. They had enough time. The text came from a burner, already deactivated." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. He moved to the window and looked out at the river, his back to her, and she watched the tension across his shoulders, the specific quality of a person holding something still that wants to move. "This floor is restricted to 12 people," he said. "You told me that." "Which means it's one of 12. 11, she said. "Unless you sent yourself to stand outside my door." He turned. She held his look without adjusting it. "Mrs. O," he said. "June Park Cheon, 3 residential staff, 2 overnight security on rotation, my personal assistant, Han, and the man who manages building systems, Cho. That's 11. Yes." "Which one was outside my room?" "I don't know yet." She stood up. "Then we need to figure it out before morning, because whoever it is now knows the text didn't make me leave. They'll recalibrate. The next move won't be a message." He looked at her for a long moment. That same assessing quality from the church, but different now, more specific, like he was measuring something he had an investment in getting right. "Are you always like this?" he said. "Like what?" "You've been in this house 6 hours. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. And then, after a pause that meant something she didn't yet have enough context to fully read, "No, it's not." He left. She didn't sleep for a long time. The next 9 days were architecture. Min-jae constructed a version of their relationship with the precision of someone who had been planning for this contingency longer than he admitted. There were photographs taken, not posed, which would have read as manufactured, but captured in the kind of moments that suggested genuine casualness. The two of them at the breakfast table with documents spread between them. Zuri at his elbow during a call with one of the organization's legitimate business managers. A candid shot from the building's security system that Chaeyeon had flagged as usable because it showed them in the main hallway walking in the same direction at the same pace, which communicated something without stating it. Zuri submitted to it with the particular discipline of someone who had spent 6 years in brand marketing and understood that image construction was a craft, not a deception. Every photograph was a choice. Every choice told a story. The story they were telling was, these two people belong to each other, and it is not a surprise. In the evenings, they worked. This was unexpected. She had anticipated the preparation to feel like rehearsal, staged, transactional, the kind of exercise where both parties were visibly aware of the performance nature of the thing. Instead, it was functional. Min-jae told her things about his family because they were things she needed to know, and she listened and asked questions and retained the information with the systematic thoroughness she applied to everything. And somewhere in the middle of the third evening, she realized they had been talking for 3 hours without either of them checking the time. He was not easy. That would have been the wrong word for him. He was precise, and he was demanding in the specific way of someone who held himself to equivalent standards and saw no reason to apply a lower bar elsewhere. And he had a quality of stillness that she was still calibrating. Not coldness, not indifference, but the hard-won composure of someone who had learned early that visible emotion was a resource that other people would use against you. She understood that. She had learned the same thing, in different rooms, for different reasons. His grandfather, Chairman Kang Hyun-woo, had built the original organization from a single shipping operation in Busan in the 1970s. He had expanded it across legitimate and illegitimate channels with a patience and strategic intelligence that Min-jae described without sentimentality. His grandfather was not a good man, he said once, with the particular flatness of someone who had fully processed a difficult truth. He was a capable one. There was a difference, and it mattered. The chairman had 2 sons. Min-jae's father, Kang Jae-won, who had died of a cardiac event at 54, and Dae-sung, who was 51 and had spent the 30 years since he'd understood what the empire was worth positioning himself to inherit it, and who had done so with an effectiveness that Min-jae described with something that was, if she listened carefully, adjacent to respect. The species of acknowledgement that exists between serious adversaries. On the 5th day, Chaeyeon came to find her, not in the East Suite, In the library on the ground floor, where Zuri had taken to working in the mornings because the light was better, and because the distance from the residential corridor gave her a space that felt, incrementally, like her own. She had spread financial documents across the large reading table, legitimate business summaries from the Kang Group's shipping and real estate holdings, cross-referenced against public filings she'd accessed through a research database Chayan had set her up with. Chayan stopped in the doorway and looked at the documents. "Those are Q3 summaries," she said. "And 2 years of prior comparatives," Zuri said. "There's a gap in the Southeast Asia shipping revenue between Q2 and Q3 of last year that doesn't match the operational reports. Either the operational reports are wrong, or the revenue figures are wrong. Which one is it?" Chayan came fully into the room. She looked at the documents with an expression that had moved just slightly from its default neutral setting. "The operational reports," she said. "We had a disruption in the Manila corridor. It was managed quietly." "Managed by whom?" A pause. "Daesung's division oversaw that corridor at the time." Zuri looked up, and the revenue discrepancy was buried in the comparative because the Q2 figures had been inflated to begin with. By the time Q3 corrected, the delta was large enough to notice, but small enough to explain away as market variance. He was skimming. "We couldn't prove it then, but you can now." Cheon looked at her with an expression that was doing something complicated. Recalibrating again, that upward adjustment, but larger this time and less contained. "Potentially," she said, "with the right framework." "Build the framework," Zuri said. "I'll help you." The family gathering was the Kang Group's Q4 convening held at the chairman's primary residence, an estate outside the city that made Seohan House look like a transitional property. 47 family members and significant organizational figures across 2 days. Black-tie dinner on the first evening, business session on the second morning. A family luncheon after that was described to Zuri as the most politically dangerous of the 3 events because it was the one with no agenda, which meant the maneuvering happened in real time and without structure to contain it. They arrived as a unit. That was deliberate. Min-jae had been specific about it. They would not arrive separately, would not be seen making separate entrances, would not allow the first image the family had of them to be anything other than 2 people who had chosen each other and were not apologizing for it. The chairman met them in the entry hall. Kang Hyun-woo was 80 years old and looked 70, which told you everything about the specific relationship he had with his own will, a man who had simply decided aging would proceed at a pace he found acceptable. He was not tall. He had the particular compactness of someone whose physical stature had never been the source of his power and who had therefore never needed it to be. His eyes were dark and extremely still, and they moved to Zuri with a directness that bypassed social courtesy entirely. Not rudely, but with the efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that looking at something other than the thing itself was a waste of time. "Zuri," he said. Her name in his mouth had a precise, considered quality, like he had practiced the pronunciation and found it satisfactory. "Chairman Kang," she said. "Thank you for having me." "You speak plainly," he said. "I try to." "Good." He looked at Min-jae once, a look that was entire conversations compressed into 2 seconds, and then moved toward the interior of the house, clearly expecting to be followed. The first evening was a war conducted in formal wear. Daesung was everything Min-jae had described, and one thing he hadn't: charming, in the specific register of someone who had learned charm as a tool rather than expressing it as a quality. He was handsome in a preserved, careful way, his hair silver at the temples with the aesthetic precision of a man who had made a decision about how he wanted to look and invested accordingly. He greeted Zuri with warmth that was entirely surface and eyes that were assessing her with an intensity he'd wrapped well, but not well enough. "Remarkable story," he said, taking her hand. "A chance meeting, and then this." Min-jae has always been decisive. "He has," she said. "Still, such a significant step. For both of you." He held her hand a beat too long. "I hope you knew what you were walking into." "I'm a quick learner," she said. His smile stayed exactly where it was, which meant it wasn't connected to anything real. "I'm sure you are." He moved away. Around the dinner table, the pressure was architectural. Questions posed as curiosity that were actually excavation, compliments that carried embedded doubts. the kind of social warfare that required you to respond to what was actually being said rather than what was being spoken. Zuri had grown up in rooms that operated this way. Different rooms, different stakes, but the grammar was the same. She held. She told a version of their meeting that was technically true in its broad strokes. The wedding that fell apart, the encounter with Min-jae, the decision. She made no apologies for the speed of it. When one of Dae-sung's allies, a man named Seo, who controlled the construction division, asked with practiced delicacy whether she had concerns about entering a family with such complex dynamics, she said, "Every family has complex dynamics. What varies is whether the people in it are honest about it." Across the table, she saw the chairman set down his glass. The luncheon the following day was when it happened. She had been warned. She had prepared. She had gone to sleep the night before in a guest room down the hall from Min-jae's and run every scenario she could construct based on 11 days of preparation and 3 days of watching Dae-sung operate in close proximity. She had not prepared for Chaeyeon. It started as a conversation. She and Chaeyeon were seated adjacent at the luncheon table, and in the general noise of 40-some people eating and talking simultaneously, Chaeyeon leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, "The framework we discussed. I found something." Zuri kept her expression neutral. "Tell me." "Not here," Chaeyeon said. "After." But after didn't come the way Zuri expected it to, because 40 minutes into the luncheon, Dae-sung stood. He didn't call for attention. He didn't need to. The quality of his standing was enough. That deliberate verticality of someone about to say something that changes the shape of the room. Conversations tapered. The chairman, at the head of the table, did not change his expression. "I want to offer a toast," Dae-sung said, "to my nephew and his wife." He raised his glass with the ease of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for longer than anyone in the room knew. Marriage is a serious undertaking. It requires honesty, transparency, a genuine commitment to something larger than oneself. He paused, the pause timed with surgical precision, which is why I want to share something with this family, in the spirit of that same honesty. He reached into his jacket. He produced a document, printed, several pages, and he laid it on the table with the deliberateness of a man who understood that the sound a document makes when it hits a surface can itself be a weapon. "This," he said, "is a contract, drafted 11 days ago, signed by both parties on the day of what was, I understand, intended to be someone else's wedding." The room went the particular silent of people who have stopped breathing. Min-jae was very still across the table from her. His stillness was not surprise. She registered that, not surprise, but arrival, the quality of a man reaching a moment he knew was coming and had not been able to prevent. "A contract marriage," Dae-sung said, 12 months, specific financial terms, designed to satisfy my father's succession requirements." He looked at the chairman. "Designed specifically to deceive you, father." The chairman looked at the document. He did not look at Min-jae. He did not look at Zuri. He looked at the document for a long time. "Where did you get that?" Min-jae said. His voice was level. It was the most frightening version of his voice she'd heard. "Does it matter?" Dae-sung said. "It matters to me." "From inside your own house," Dae-sung said. "Which tells you something, doesn't it, about how well you know the people around you? The mole. The server access, the text message, someone standing outside her door. All of it arriving at this table in a single document that Dae-sung was now placing in front of his father with the practiced sorrow of a man performing grief he did not feel. "Father," Dae-sung said, "I think you deserve to make your succession decision with accurate information." The chairman picked up the document. He read the first page, then the second. He read with the absolute stillness of someone who had received difficult information before and knew that the first response was the one that mattered most. The table waited. Zuri looked at Min-jae. He was looking at his grandfather. His hands on the table in front of him were flat and still. She could see the line of his jaw and the specific way he was holding himself. Not collapsing, not deflecting, absorbing. Then the chairman set the document down. He looked at Zuri, not at Min-jae, at her. "Is this accurate?" he said. The room was so quiet she could hear the sound of someone shifting in a chair 2 seats away. She could say no. She could construct a denial. Not entirely implausible. The document was one-sided. She could complicate the narrative enough to create doubt. She could buy time, regroup, find another angle, or she could do what she had done in the church. Yes, she said. A sound moved through the room, not loud, just present. The contract is accurate, she said. I signed it 11 days ago in the back of a car, in a wedding dress that belonged to a different morning. The financial terms are as described. The arrangement was designed to fulfill your succession requirement. She paused. What the document doesn't describe is everything that happened after I signed it, but the contract itself? Yes, it's real. The chairman looked at her without blinking. Zuri, Min-jae said. Low, a warning and something else underneath it. He asked me, she said. She kept her eyes on the chairman. I'm not going to lie to him. That's not the person I am, and it's not the wife I intend to be, contract or otherwise. The silence stretched. Then Dae-sung said with the satisfaction of a man collecting on a bet he'd placed months ago, Father, surely this settles. Be quiet, Dae-sung. The chairman's voice was not loud. It had never needed to be. Dae-sung sat down. The chairman looked at the document again, then he looked at Zuri. Then he looked, finally, at Min-jae. That compressed 2-second look that was entire conversations. We will speak tonight, he said to Min-jae. The three of us. He rose from the table. The luncheon, by all understood consensus, was over. As people began to move and the room dissolved into the kind of controlled chaos that follows a detonation, Zuri felt a hand close briefly around her wrist beneath the table. She looked down. Min-jae's hand. Not gripping, just present. 3 fingers against the inside of her wrist for 2 seconds and then gone. She didn't know what it meant. She filed it. In the corridor afterward, while guests redistributed themselves and the household staff moved around them with the carefully neutral efficiency of people pretending they hadn't heard everything, Chaeyeon appeared at Zuri's shoulder. I need to show you something, she said. Now, before tonight. What did you find? Zuri said. Chaeyeon's jaw was set. Her eyes had a quality Zuri hadn't seen in them before. Not fear exactly, but its functional cousin. The thing that looks like composure, but is actually composure working very hard. Dae-sung's discrepancies, she said. I found the full pattern. 11 years of it. Not the Manila corridor. That was just the piece I could see from the surface. She paused. He's been siphoning from every division, systematically. The total is... She stopped. Started again. The total is larger than the legitimate value of the succession he's been fighting for. Zuri looked at her. How much larger? He's stolen more from this family than the company is worth on paper, Chaeyeon said. If this comes out, it doesn't just disqualify him, it destroys the financial structure of the entire organization. The corridor was full of people moving around them, the low current of post-detonation conversation running in every direction, and Zuri stood very still in the middle of it. He knows you're close to finding it, she said. Chaeyeon's expression confirmed it before she spoke. The document he produced today wasn't just about discrediting the marriage, Zuri said. It was a distraction. He needed the room focused on Min-jae's credibility so no one was looking at his balance sheets. Yes, Chaeyeon said, which means tonight's meeting with the chairman. Dae-sung is going to use it. Whatever happens in that room, he needs Min-jae discredited before the financial evidence can be assembled and presented. We have maybe 6 hours, Chaeyeon said. 6 hours to build a case that could counter 11 years of systematic theft in a house that contained at least one person feeding information to the enemy before a meeting with the most powerful man in the family that Dae-sung had already maneuvered into looking like a tribunal. Zuri looked at Chaeyeon. Show me everything you have, she said. Starting now. They moved toward the east wing together, and behind them in the corridor, somewhere in the reconfiguring crowd, a phone was raised and a message was sent to a number that would route through 2 relays before reaching Kang Dae-sung's private line. 3 words, all that was needed. She knows. Moving. They worked in Chaeyeon's room because it was the most defensible space available. A corner suite in the east wing with 2 exterior walls and a single door, which meant only 1 entry point and enough ambient noise from the river below to cover conversation. Chaeyeon's laptop was already open when they arrived. 3 additional drives connected via hub, and the sight of it, the density of preparation, the evidence of someone who had been building this case in secret for longer than the last 6 hours, told Zuri something critical about the woman sitting across from her. Chaeyeon had been working on this before today, before the luncheon, before Dae-sung stood up with the contract. How long? Zuri said. Chaeyeon looked up from the screen. Since the Manila discrepancy. 8 months. You've been building a case against Dae-sung for 8 months without telling Min Jae. I told Min Jae 6 weeks ago. He told me to continue but quietly. He didn't want Dae-sung spooked before we had the full picture. And now Dae-sung moved first anyway. Because someone told him we were close. Chaeyeon's voice was flat, controlled. The voice of someone managing fury that had nowhere useful to go yet. Someone in the organization, not just the house. Someone with access to my work. Zuri looked at the drives. Who has access to your systems? In theory, no one beyond Min Jae. In practice, she stopped. Her jaw tightened. Han, Min Jae's personal assistant. He manages system access permissions for the senior team. Han. She'd seen him twice in 11 days. A slight man in his late 30s who moved through the house with the quality of wallpaper, present and unregistered. She ran back through every room he'd been in and who he'd been adjacent to and what he might have had access to while appearing to be looking at something else. Is he here tonight? Zuri said. He was at the luncheon. I haven't seen him since. They looked at each other. Show me the financials, Zuri said. Everything. What Chaeyeon had built over 8 months was a structure of interlocking evidence that was, in its way, a kind of terrible artistry. The documentation of a theft so systematic and so long sustained that it had become infrastructure, embedded in the legitimate business operations the way rot embeds in load-bearing wood. You couldn't see it from the surface. You had to know where to look and how to look and be willing to follow each thread until it led somewhere that made you put the thread down and sit quietly for a moment before picking it up again. 11 years. 43 shell entities across 7 jurisdictions. The money moved in patterns that mimicked legitimate transfer activity closely enough to pass standard audits and diverged just enough to accumulate, over time, into a number that sat on the screen in front of Zuri and made her breathe differently for a moment before she regulated herself back. $840 million. Not all liquid. Distributed across real estate holdings, investment vehicles, 2 private equity positions, a shipping operation registered in Cyprus that appeared on its surface to be entirely legitimate, but traceable. Chaeyeon had traced it. This is enough, Zuri said. It's enough to destroy him, Chaeyeon said. It's also enough to destabilize the entire legitimate structure of the Kang Group if it comes out without being managed. The shell entities intersect with 2 of the legitimate shipping divisions. If those relationships become public before we can clean the documentation, the legal businesses take damage they didn't earn. Significant damage. The chairman's life's work. Zuri sat back. The clock on Chaeyeon's laptop read 4:47 p.m. The meeting with the chairman was at 8. We need to present this tonight, Zuri said, but structured so the chairman can see the full picture without the collateral damage becoming the headline. In 3 hours. In 3 hours. Zuri. Chaeyeon's voice shifted, not softer, more direct, which in her register was the equivalent. There's something else. She navigated to a different partition of the drive. Another set of documents, these ones more recent, the past 6 weeks. Han system access logs, she said. I pulled them this morning before the luncheon. I wasn't sure what I was looking at initially. She turned the screen. Zuri read. Han had accessed Chaeyeon's financial research partition 11 times in the past 6 weeks. The access was brief each time, a few minutes, enough to read and not enough to extract large files without triggering size alerts. But in the third access 6 days ago, he'd been in the folder containing the framework Zuri and Chaeyeon had discussed. The framework that hadn't existed when Zuri arrived. The framework she had helped build. He'd read it. 3 days before Dae-sung stood up at that luncheon table. He fed the timeline to Dae-sung, Zuri said. Yes. Which means Dae-sung knew we were close to having the full picture. He moved with the contract exposure to discredit Min Jae before we could use the financial evidence. Yes. And Han is still in this house. Chaeyeon looked at her. Zuri stood up. Get Min Jae. The security situation. Get Min Jae now. If Han knows we've identified him, he moves. If he moves, he takes whatever he can, and Daesung has warning and cover. We need to close this before he... The door opened. Not knocked. Opened. And the man standing in it was not Min-jae, and not Park, and not anyone Zuri had a prepared category for. Large, in dark clothes, with the specific quality of someone who had not come to talk and was not going to. Cheon moved first, lunging toward the laptop, and the man crossed the room in 3 steps, and his arm came down, and Cheon went sideways off her chair with a sound that was brief and terrible. The laptop hit the floor. One of the drives disconnected. Zuri was already moving, not toward the door, toward the window, because the door was blocked, and the window was the only other geometry available to her, and she grabbed the floor lamp beside the dresser as she moved, the cord pulling free from the wall with a sharp pop, and she swung it backward without fully turning and felt it connect with something solid, and heard a sound from the man that was pain, but not enough pain. She got the window open, 2nd floor. The drop was 12 feet onto stone patio. She looked back. The man was between her and Chaeyeon, who was on the floor and moving, conscious, trying to get up. The laptop was under the desk. The drives were scattered. She did the math in the time it took to breathe once. She grabbed the drive closest to her foot, the primary one, the one Chaeyeon had pulled from her bag and connected first, which Zuri had registered as deliberate, the habit of someone who always led with the most important thing. And she went out the window. The drop was worse than 12 feet felt in theory. She hit the stone patio with both feet and her knees buckled, and she went forward onto her palms. And the drive in her right hand took impact, and she rolled and came up already moving, one shoe gone, her shoulder burning from where she'd caught the windowsill on the way down. She ran. The estate grounds in the October dark were large and partially lit, security lighting that covered the main paths and left the peripheral areas in varied shadow. She cut away from the main path immediately, moving across wet grass in one shoe and barefoot, the drive clenched in her hand, running toward the section of the ground she'd identified during the afternoon's outdoor reception as containing the secondary security station. Behind her, from the 2nd floor window, she heard the sound of the frame hitting the exterior wall as it was thrown wider. She ran harder. The secondary security station was a stone outbuilding 40 meters from the main house. She'd noted it at 2 p.m. because Park Sung-il had gone to it during the luncheon and returned, and she'd made a practice of noting where Park went. She hit the door with her shoulder, and it opened, and the 2 men inside came to their feet with the particular speed of people whose entire professional function was readiness. And she said, breathing hard, one shoe, dress torn at the knee where she'd gone down on the patio. Park Sung-il, now, and lock this door. Boss. One of them was already on the radio. The other locked the door. She stood in the middle of the small room and looked at the drive in her hand. The casing had a crack along one edge from the impact on the patio. She turned it carefully, looking for damage to the connectors, and found one slightly bent pin on the primary port. She straightened it with her thumbnail. It took 40 seconds, and her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. Park arrived in under 4 minutes. She told him everything in the time it took him to assess her physical condition. Brief, sequential, no editorial, the relevant facts in the order that made the subsequent response clear. The man in Chaeyeon's room. Chaeyeon down. Han's access logs. The drive in her hand. Park's face during this recitation was the face of a man being confirmed in a suspicion he had not been certain enough of to act on, which meant he had suspected Han and had not had evidence and had been living with that uncertainty in his chest while continuing to operate in a house with a man he couldn't fully trust. Chaeyeon, Zuri said. My team has her, Park said. His radio had been active the entire time she was speaking. She's up, concussion possibly, they're assessing. Han, in his room. We have eyes on him. A pause. He hasn't moved. He doesn't know we know yet. He will soon. The man who came through Chaeyeon's door is going to report. Yes. Then we have minutes. Park looked at her. A look that contained a species of respect she hadn't been seeking but registered anyway. Then he spoke into his radio in Korean, clipped and rapid, and things began to move. Min-jae arrived at the security station 90 seconds later. He came through the door and his eyes went to her. The torn dress, the bare foot, the drive, and something moved across his face in a sequence she tracked. Assessment, relief, assessment again,
and then the compression of all of it behind the operational face. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm functional," she said. "Look." She held up the drive. He looked at it, then at her. "Cheon's full case," she said. 11 years. Everything. 840 million in documented theft across 43 entities. She paused. "We have 2 hours before your grandfather's meeting. We need to get this onto a clean system and build a presentation that he can follow, and we need to do it while Park deals with Han, and we need it to be airtight because Dae-sung is going to walk into that meeting tonight believing he's already won." Min-jae took the drive from her hand. He looked at it for a moment, at the cracked casing and the straightened pin and whatever she'd left on it from the patio. "You went out a second-floor window," he said. "It was the available option." "In one shoe. The other one didn't make it." Something happened in his expression that wasn't quite the thing she'd have predicted. Not admiration, which would have been the wrong register, but something that was recognition, the specific quality of someone seeing themselves in an unexpected mirror. He turned to Park. 4 words in Korean. Park nodded and left. Then Min-jae turned back to her. "Can you work for the next 2 hours?" "Yes." "Your shoulder." "It'll still be injured in 2 hours. It'll manage." He held her look for a beat, then, "Follow me." The room Min-jae took her to was a space she hadn't seen in 11 days in the house. A room behind his office that contained a secondary workstation with an air-gapped system, physically disconnected from the estate's main network. He'd had it built, he said while connecting the drive, for exactly the category of situation in which the main network couldn't be trusted. She thought about all the conversations they'd had in the house these past 11 days. All the things that had moved through systems she now understood were compromised. Han had access to the regular network, she said. Not this one. No one had access to this one. It's never been connected. He looked at the drive. The bent pin caught the port on the second try, and the system registered the connection. How much of this did Cheon have organized? Enough. The framework is clean. We need to build the presentation layer, so something the chairman can follow without needing to understand the underlying technical structure. He'll understand more than you expect. Then we make it as deep as he needs and as clear as he deserves. She pulled the second chair to the desk. Her bare foot on the stone floor was cold, and she registered it as information and set it aside. Start with the Manila corridor. That's where the pattern is most legible. They worked. It was not like anything she'd done before, which was also not like anything she expected to feel while doing it. The two of them at a screen in a locked room while outside the operational response was unfolding. Park's team moving through the estate with the quiet precision of people who had been waiting for the word. Han being collected from his room with whatever he'd managed to prepare for a departure that was no longer available to him. She pulled the financial threads, and Min-jae provided context for each one. The business relationships, the timing, the specific organizational moments that each transaction had been designed to hide behind. He knew his organization the way you know a body you've lived in, not always consciously, but completely. When she identified a pattern, he'd provide the human architecture behind it, and together the thing built into something that was no longer a collection of data but a story, the kind of story a man like Chairman Kang Hyun-woo had spent his life learning to read. At 6:40, Park knocked and came in. "Han," Min-jae said, "contained." He had a bag packed. A pause. And a phone. Secondary device, not registered to us. 11 months of message history. With Dae-sung. With a number that traces to Dae-sung's legal counsel, same routing they used for the contract leak. Park's expression was the expression of a man delivering information he had needed for a long time and was experiencing the specific exhaustion of confirmed suspicion. He gave them everything, Min-jae. The research, the conversations, your grandfather's private communications. 11 months. The room was quiet. "Okay," Min-jae said. "Just that." Okay. 2 letters carrying the weight of 11 months of exposure and the specific grief of betrayal by someone in the innermost circle, and then he turned back to the screen. Zuri looked at him. At the line of his profile, the jaw, the specific quality of a person absorbing something painful without letting it interrupt the work. She looked back at the screen. At 7:15, Cheon came in. A bruise was developing along her left cheekbone, and she was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a headache. But her eyes were clear, and her first question was about the drive.
Pin bent on impact, Zuri said. I straightened it. Everything loaded. Cheon sat down and looked at the screen for 30 seconds. Then she said, The Cypress entity? You haven't linked it to the Q1 distribution. I was getting there.
I'll do it. You... She looked at Zuri's bare foot. You need a shoe. I need to finish this.
You can finish it with a shoe? She said something in Korean toward the door, and one of Park's team responded, and 3 minutes later a pair of flat-soled house shoes appeared, slightly too large but present, and Zuri put them on without looking away from the screen. At 7:52, they printed. The printer was a physical unit connected only to the air-gapped system, and the documents that came out were 41 pages. Clean, organized, the financial evidence structured into a narrative that moved from the earliest identifiable manipulation through to the present, with the shell entity map as the final page. 43 boxes connected by lines that showed, with graphic clarity, how the money had moved and where it had gone and what it had become. Min-jae held the printed document. He looked at the last page, the map, for a long moment. He built a parallel empire, he said. With your family's money, Zuri said. He looked at her. Your grandfather needs to see it, she said. All of it, tonight. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Then he said, In the room tonight, he's going to ask you questions. Not me. He'll direct things at me because I'm the one he's deciding about. But the questions that matter, the ones about what you know and why you stayed, he'll ask you. I know. You don't have to... Min-jae. She held his look steadily. I went out a second-floor window tonight for 41 pages of financial evidence. I think we're past the point where I need to be managed. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Too much weight in the room for a smile. But its precursor. The thing that happens in the face before something is allowed to become lighter. Yes, he said. We are. They walked to the chairman's private study at 8 o'clock exactly, the 41 pages in Min-jae's hand, Zuri at his left shoulder in a torn dress and borrowed shoes with a bruised palm and one working earring, the diamond drop on the right side that had stayed in through everything, and the empty lobe on the left where the other had been lost somewhere between the window and the patio. The study door was open. Chairman Kang Hyun-woo was at his desk. Dae-sung was already there, seated in the chair to the left, and when he saw what Min-jae was carrying, his expression shifted. Just slightly, just enough. The first crack in 11 months of meticulous positioning, a man glimpsing the shape of something he hadn't accounted for. The chairman looked at the document in Min-jae's hand. Then he looked at Dae-sung. And in the quality of that look, in the specific way an 80-year-old man who had spent his life reading rooms looked at his younger son in the moment before the door closed, Zuri understood that the chairman had not been entirely surprised. That some part of him had known or suspected or had been waiting for the evidence to arrive in a form he couldn't ignore. Min-jae set the 41 pages on the desk between them. The door closed, and Kang Dae-sung, for the first time in 11 years, had nowhere left to. The study door closed with the soft finality of a well-made thing, and for a moment no one in the room moved. The fire in the corner grate was the only sound, a low, persistent crackle that had no interest in the human architecture arranged around the desk. Chairman Kang Hyun-woo sat behind it with his hands folded on the surface, not on the 41 pages but beside them, as though he had decided the document would remain where Min-jae had placed it until he chose to engage with it on his own terms. Dae-sung was in the chair to the left, and the quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of a man managing his presentation, but the stillness of a man recalculating, running new numbers against a situation that had shifted faster than he'd anticipated. Zuri stood at Min-jae's shoulder and said nothing. She had learned in the past 11 days that Min-jae's silences were not empty. They were operational. The chairman spoke first. He spoke in Korean, and then, with the deliberateness of a man making a choice about who was included in a conversation, switched to English. Sit down, he said. All of them. A single instruction that contained in its economy an entire posture toward the situation. They sat, Min-jae to the right of the desk, Zuri beside him, Dae-sung to the left, not looking at either of them now, looking at the fire. The chairman picked up the 41 pages. He read the way he did everything, without performance, without the telegraphing of reaction that most people use to communicate that they are engaged. He turned pages at intervals that suggested genuine reading rather than scanning, and when he reached the shell entity map on the final page, he held it for longer than the others and then set the entire document down with the same careful placement as before. He looked at Daesung. 43 entities, he said. Daesung said nothing.
11 years. Still nothing. Daesung's jaw was set. He had the expression of a man who had prepared for several versions of this moment and was now determining which version he was actually in.
You were going to let Min-jae take the blame for this, the chairman said. The contract. The manufactured marriage. You were going to use it to remove him, and then… He paused. Not for effect, for accuracy. And then there would have been nothing between you and the succession except me, and I am 79.
Daesung looked at him then, and in his look was something that was not quite remorse and not quite defiance, but the compound result of a man who had spent 11 years doing a thing and had told himself a sufficient number of stories about why it was justified that he had, somewhere along the way, partially believed them. You were going to give it to him anyway, Daesung said. His voice was level. You decided years ago. I watched you decide. I watched you look at him and look at me and make a choice that had nothing to do with capability. It had everything to do with capability, the chairman said, and with character. I built 3 of the divisions that…
With my money, the chairman said. Money you were also stealing. Money you moved through Cyprus and Delaware and 2 accounts in Singapore that you believed I would never find because you believed I was an old man who had stopped looking. He paused. I have never stopped looking, Daesung, at anything. The fire crackled. Daesung looked at his father with an expression that was, underneath everything else, the expression of a son who had wanted something from a parent for a very long time and had never received it and had eventually decided to take by force what would not be given by choice. It was not a sympathetic expression, but it was a legible one. Zuri looked at it and understood something about how long this room had been building. What happens now? Daesung said. Now, the chairman said, you will provide full accounting, every entity, every account, every transfer. Your legal team will cooperate with mine completely. The assets that can be recovered will be recovered. Those that can't will be documented. He paused. The operational divisions you oversee will be transferred to interim management effective tomorrow morning. And me. The chairman looked at his younger son for a long time. You are my son, he said. That doesn't change. But you are no longer part of this organization, and the legal consequences of what you've done are not something I will obstruct. Daesung absorbed this. His face went through several things in quick succession, anger, and then something that was almost grief, and then the specific blankness of a man closing a door on a room he will not enter again. He stood. He looked at Min-jae once, not with hatred, which would have been easier to categorize, but with the look of a man acknowledging the outcome of a long contest. Then he looked at Zuri. You, he said, not with anger, almost with something like recognition. You're more dangerous than he is. I'm just better at reading documents, she said. He left the room. The door closed behind him. From somewhere in the house came the sound of Park Sung-il's team. Movement, voices, the operational machinery of a situation being managed. Daesung would not leave the estate tonight on his own terms. He would leave it on theirs. The room was very quiet. The chairman looked at Min-jae for a long time. Then he looked at Zuri. Then he looked at the 41 pages on his desk. The contract, he said to Zuri. You acknowledged it at lunch. Yes. Why? She held his look. Because you asked me directly. And because lying to you would have meant I was exactly the kind of person who should not be in this family. The chairman was quiet. The fire moved. My grandson, he said finally, has made impulsive decisions before. Decisions that were strategically sound but personally costly. He paused. This one is different. How? Min-jae said. Because this time the decision came with someone who finished the work. The chairman looked at Zuri. The framework you built with Chaeyeon, the window, the drive. He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said everything. I was informed an hour ago. Park is thorough. Zuri said nothing. The contract was a transaction, the chairman said. What happened after the contract is something else. He picked up the 41 pages one more time, looked at the top sheet, set it down. I will make my announcement at the close of the Q4 gathering tomorrow. Min-jae's succession is confirmed. He looked at his grandson. The rest is between the two of you. He stood. The meeting, by every understood signal, was over. At the door he stopped without turning. The dress from the first wedding, he said. The one you arrived in. Mrs. O told me you asked her to store it. Zuri waited. Burn it, the chairman said. You won't need it anymore. He walked out. The silence he left behind was the fullest silence of the entire day. Not tense, not expectant, just large. The kind of silence that exists after a thing has been decided and the decision has been received, and there is, for the first time in a long time, no next move required in the next 30 seconds. Min-jae sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the fire. Zuri sat beside him and looked at the fire too. Han, she said eventually, Park has him. He'll be processed tonight and transferred to the attorneys in the morning. A pause. He had a sister. Dae-sung had leverage on her. It's not an excuse, but it's the architecture. It's always the architecture, she said. Min-jae looked at his hands. I should have found it sooner. You found it. You found it. We found it, she said. That's how this worked. He looked at her. In the firelight, with the charcoal suit and the open collar, and the specific exhaustion of a man who had been running at operational intensity for 11 days and had just watched his uncle walk out of his grandfather's study for the last time, he looked like what he was. Someone who had won something that had cost more than winning should cost. The particular face of a person standing on the other side of a necessary thing. Your shoulder, he said. It'll bruise, it's not structural. Your hand. She looked at her palm. The skin was abraded from the patio, a wide raspberry of broken surface that she'd been ignoring for 3 hours through the particular adrenaline economy of people who don't have time to register pain until the situation permits it. Also not structural, she said. He reached forward and picked up her hand from her knee. Not dramatically, with the same deliberateness he applied to everything. A man who had decided to do a thing and was doing it. He turned her palm up and looked at the abrasion with the focused attention of someone who was not accustomed to looking at other people's injuries and finding them difficult to look at. He let go. He sat back. Thank you, he said. It was the plainest 2 words he'd said in 11 days. No qualification, no strategic framing, just the words, landing in the space between them with all the weight of what they were standing in for. You're welcome, she said. The months that followed did not move the way Zuri had expected. She had anticipated a kind of managed return to stability. The operational work of building Min-jae's public succession, while the private architecture of their arrangement continued on its contract schedule, everything proceeding toward the 12-month endpoint with the orderly progression of a well-drafted agreement. What happened instead was life. Dae-sung's legal process was protracted and expensive, and generated the kind of quiet industry coverage that comes without names attached because the people involved have sufficient resources to keep names out of things. The recovered assets exceeded initial projections. Chaeyeon's framework held up under the forensic accounting process, and the Cyprus entity yielded more than any of them had anticipated. The King Group's legitimate operations absorbed the restructuring with the resilience of businesses that had been built correctly under layers that had been built badly, and by the end of the second month, the financial architecture was cleaner than it had been in over a decade. Han's situation resolved in the way these things resolve, with lawyers and agreements and the particular gray outcome of a man who had cooperated fully and would spend the next several years paying for it in ways that didn't involve a sell. His sister, who had been the leverage point, was quietly helped through a business difficulty that Dae-sung had engineered as a control mechanism. Chaeyeon handled it. She did not mention it to Min-jae or Zuri until it was done, and when she did mention it, she described it in 2 sentences and changed the subject, which was the most Chaeyeon thing that had happened yet. Chairman Kang made his announcement. Min-jae was named successor with the particular formal weight of a man who had been deciding this for years and had now decided to let it be public. The coverage in the relevant circles was what it was, some admiring, some skeptical, some fixated on the marriage in ways that were predictable and uninteresting. A profile in a business publication described Zuri as an unexpected addition to the Kang family, and she read it once and used it to level a plant pot that was tilting on the windowsill of her office.
She'd claimed the library eventually as her working space, and Min-jae had not objected and had, in fact, arranged for a second desk to be added without being asked, which she'd noticed and not commented on. Marcus Holt's dissolution proceeded with the efficiency of a man who knows exactly which threads to pull. The $4.3 million was recovered through a legal process that Marcus's attorney tried to complicate and failed to complicate because the documentation was airtight and the opposing counsel was not the kind of person who made errors he hadn't already planned for. Marcus's professional network became aware of the theft with the quiet totality of information that travels through the particular channels that matter. His apartment in Murray Hill was sold to cover debts. He moved, Zuri heard from a source she hadn't expected. Priya, the other bridesmaid, who had texted out of nowhere 6 weeks after the wedding with the specific energy of someone who had processed a significant amount and needed to report it, to somewhere in New Jersey. She did not feel what she'd expected to feel about this. What she'd expected was satisfaction. What she actually felt was closer to resolution. The closing of a door that had been left open in her nervous system without her fully realizing it, and the particular quality of air that comes in when a door like that finally shuts. Danielle she did not hear from. She did not look for her either. Some losses were the kind you processed by letting them stay lost. Her mother came to visit in the 3rd month. This had been negotiated carefully. Her mother was 68, not 71, because Zuri had gotten the number wrong under stress and had corrected it in a subsequent phone call that her mother had treated as evidence of her daughter's fundamental unreliability under pressure, lovingly. She came on a Tuesday and stayed 5 days and moved through Seohan House with the specific alert quality of a woman conducting a thorough assessment while appearing to be enjoying a visit. On the 3rd evening, she and Zuri sat in the library with tea and the particular silence of a mother and daughter who know each other well enough not to need scaffolding. "He looks at you," her mother said. "He looks at everything. It's how he operates." "Not like that. Not everything." She held her cup. "The way he looks at you is the way your father looked at me the year before he admitted it to himself." Zuri was quiet. "I'm not telling you what to do," her mother said. "I'm telling you what I see. The contract ends in 4 months." "I know." She sipped her tea. "And?" Zuri looked at the bookshelf across from her. "And I don't know yet." Her mother nodded once, the nod of a woman who had raised a daughter who took time to know things and had decided, somewhere along the way, that this was a quality rather than a flaw. The understanding of what she felt arrived not as a revelation, but as an accumulation. The slow layering of small moments that each meant nothing individually, and together meant everything. It was the way he handed her documents he thought she'd find relevant, without comment, without the performance of thoughtfulness that would have made the gesture smaller. It was the way arguments between them, real ones, about operational decisions where they genuinely disagreed, ended with both of them having moved rather than one having conceded. It was the night, 2 months in, when she'd found him in the library at 2 a.m. with his grandfather's old shipping ledgers spread across the table, not reading them but sitting with them, and she'd sat down across from him and they'd been quiet together for an hour, and it had been the least lonely she'd remembered feeling in a very long time. It was the scar on her palm from the patio, which had healed to a faint line, and the way he'd looked at it once, just once, weeks later, with an expression he hadn't bothered to organize before she saw it. The contract's expiration date was a Tuesday in October. Exactly 12 months from the day they'd signed it in the back of a car outside St. Augustine's, the city indifferent around them. She came downstairs that evening to find him in the main study. His study now, his grandfather having formally transferred the household, with the original contract on the desk in front of him. 41 pages. Not the financial evidence, the original agreement, the one she'd amended in the car with his pen. He was standing behind the desk. He wasn't sitting. He was looking at the document with the expression of a man who has been deciding something and has decided it. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. "You don't have to stay," he said. "I know. The settlement is arranged. Cheyenne confirmed the transfer this morning. You can leave tonight or tomorrow or whenever you want, and everything in the agreement is fulfilled." "I know," she said again. He looked at her. The study lamp was the only light, and it threw the room into the particular amber of late evenings in old buildings, and he stood in it with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and the contract in front of him.
and he looked exactly like what he was, a man waiting with the specific discipline of someone who has learned to wait without showing the cost of it for something he has not allowed himself to want out loud. "Min-jae," she said. "Yes." "Pick it up." He picked up the contract. He held it for a moment. She watched his hands, the same hands that had been flat and still on the table at the luncheon, the hands that had briefly held hers in the dark in front of his grandfather. He looked at it one more time. Then he moved to the fireplace and held it over the grate and let it catch from the bottom, the way paper catches. Quickly, completely, with no hesitation once it starts. He didn't drop it. He held it while it burned. She crossed the room and stood beside him, and they watched it go. The terms, the signatures, the margin amendment in her handwriting, the subsections and clauses, and all the architecture of a transaction that had stopped being a transaction sometime around the third week and had been something else since, building quietly under the surface of every working evening and every argument and every shared silence, the way real things build. The last page curled and went dark. He turned from the fireplace and looked at her, and there was nothing managed in his expression now. Not the controlled face of a man whose organization had needed him to be unreadable, not the strategic blankness of someone conducting an assessment. Just the face underneath all of that, which was a person's face, imperfect and specific and present. "The settlement," he started. "I don't want the settlement," she said. He was quiet. "What I want," she said, "is a different conversation, one that isn't covered by that document." She looked at the grate, where the last of the ashes were settling. "You want to have that conversation?" He looked at her for a long moment. A real one. Not the 2-second compressed communication he used in family meetings, but the kind of look that takes its time because what it's looking at deserves that. "Yes," he said. That was all. Just yes. Outside, the Hudson moved in the dark the way it always did, continuous and indifferent and old, making no accommodations for what was happening in the rooms along its banks. The city beyond it was the city it had always been, enormous and unsentimental, carrying its millions through their ordinary and extraordinary days without commentary. Inside, the fire settled. She thought about the morning a year ago. The ivory dress, the supply closet, the bouquet of white peonies that she'd handed to a stunned bridesmaid before walking out of a building and into a life she hadn't planned. She thought about signing her name in the back of a moving car with a borrowed pen, and the way that had felt like an exit when it was actually an entrance, and the particular mercy of not knowing the difference when you're standing at the threshold. She had walked in with nothing left to lose. That was what Min-jae had said in the church. She had nothing left to protect in that room. And he had been right, which was the thing about having nothing left to lose. It made you available. Stripped of the careful investments and the managed risks and the calculated presentations of yourself. You were simply a person standing in a situation deciding who you actually were. She had decided, over and over, in the supply corridor and the car and the study and the window and the stone patio and the locked room with the drive in her hand, she had decided. Not once, and finally, but the way real decisions are made, repeatedly, in small increments, until the accumulation of them becomes a direction you've been walking in for long enough that turning around would require more explanation than continuing. He reached up and touched the empty lobe of her left ear, where the diamond had been lost on the patio in October, and had never been replaced because she hadn't replaced it, and he hadn't mentioned it. The absent earring, a small artifact of that night that had been living in the space between them without a category. "I'll get you another one," he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He said it the same way she'd said "I know" to him twice 7 minutes ago. "I want to." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire was low and the room was warm, and outside the city moved through its night with the full force of its indifference, which was, she had come to understand, a kind of freedom. The freedom of a place that doesn't watch you, that has no investment in your story, that will continue its own enormous life, whether you succeed or fail or burn a contract in a fireplace on a Tuesday in October. The story that mattered was this one, the one she was standing in. "Okay," she said, "not about the earring only, about everything it was standing in for, the whole accumulated weight of 12 months that had moved from transaction to something with no name in any contract she'd ever read.
The kind of thing that exists in the space between two people who have seen each other at their worst and stayed anyway. Not because the contract required it, but because the alternative had gradually become unthinkable. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She turned toward the window and he stood beside her and they looked out at the river together, the same river she'd seen on the first afternoon, gray and moving and entirely unimpressed with the complexity of human arrangements. It was the same river. She was not the same person. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. O was moving through the evening routines with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who had seen the household change and had updated her understanding of it without requiring a formal announcement. Chaeyeon was in the East Wing running Q1 projections for the newly restructured divisions. Park Sung-il was at his station at the end of the corridor, doing what he always did, standing between the people inside this house and whatever the world outside it intended. And Zuri Bennett, who had walked into a disastrous wedding one October morning with 3 years of misplaced trust and an ivory dress and a stubborn, costly, absolute refusal to be less than she was, Zuri stood at the window of a house that had become hers, not by contract, but by the harder and less legible process of being exactly herself inside it until it fit, and she felt the specific weight of a year settling into the past behind her. And what was in front of her was not certain and not mapped and not covered by any document that had ever been drafted. It was better than that. It was just hers.